In this episode, we focus on something that sounds like project management, but is actually one of the strongest risk reduction moves you can make in compliance work. Defining roles and responsibilities early so an assessment or audit is not a last-minute scramble. Assessments and audits tend to create stress because they compress time, surface hidden assumptions, and force people to produce evidence under pressure. The surprising part is that many painful audit experiences have very little to do with security weaknesses and a lot to do with basic coordination problems, like nobody knowing who owns a control, who can provide evidence, who can answer assessor questions, or who is authorized to make decisions during the assessment. When roles are unclear, teams waste time, duplicate work, and sometimes contradict each other in ways that create findings. When roles are clear, the assessment becomes a structured verification of a control program that is already operating, and the organization can respond calmly and consistently. The goal here is to help you prepare for an assessment by defining roles and responsibilities early, so the assessment process itself becomes predictable, defensible, and less disruptive. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CyberAuthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong first step is understanding what an assessment actually asks of an organization, because that informs what roles you need. An assessor is trying to determine whether controls exist, whether they are implemented as described, whether they operate consistently, and whether there is evidence to prove all of that. That means your organization must be able to explain the system boundary, explain the control selection and tailoring decisions, show where controls are implemented, demonstrate who operates them, and produce evidence that they are working. In other words, an assessment is not just a technical inspection. It is a test of governance, operations, and documentation discipline. If you define roles early, you create a map of who will answer which kinds of questions and who will provide which kinds of evidence. That map keeps the organization from guessing in real time and reduces the chance that the assessor drives the process in an unstructured way. When you know what the assessor needs, you can assign people to meet those needs intentionally. One important role is the overall assessment lead, sometimes called a coordinator, even if your organization uses different language. This person is responsible for keeping the assessment organized, setting the pace, managing communications, tracking requests, and ensuring the organization responds consistently. The assessment lead is not necessarily the most technical person. They're the person who can keep threads from getting tangled. They manage the flow of evidence, schedule interviews, and make sure the same question is not answered differently by different teams. A beginner mistake is assuming the system owner automatically becomes the assessment lead, but system owners often have too much technical and operational work to also manage the coordination overhead. A dedicated coordinator role reduces chaos because it creates one place where the assessment story is controlled and consistent. This role also protects engineers because it reduces the number of interruptions and prevents assessors from pulling technical staff into unplanned conversations without context. Another critical role is the system owner or authorizing official equivalent, meaning the person who has accountability for the system's risk posture and compliance. This role is responsible for understanding the system mission, approving risk decisions, and representing ownership when the assessor asks governance questions. The system owner does not need to know every technical detail, but they must be able to explain why the system exists, what information types it handles, what the impact level is, and how control selection aligns with requirements. This role also becomes important when assessment questions reveal gaps or ambiguities that require decisions, such as whether a control is inherited or whether an exception should be documented. Without an empowered owner, assessment processes can stall because teams find issues, but no one has authority to resolve them. Defining ownership early ensures decisions happen quickly and consistently. It also signals to assessors that governance is real because there is an accountable leader, not just a collection of technical staff. Control owners are the next layer, and this is where earlier control allocation work becomes invaluable. For each control or control family, there should be an identified owner who can explain how the control is implemented and how it is operated. Some control owners will be system team members, and some will be shared service owners for common controls like centralized identity, network protections, or centralized logging. The key is that the assessor's questions about a control must reach someone who can answer them accurately and produce evidence without guessing. If you have a control that is partially inherited, you may need two control owners for different portions, and you must coordinate them so the overall control story is coherent. A common failure is when each owner answers only their part without connecting it to the whole, leaving the assessor to conclude the control is incomplete. Defining control owners early includes defining the handoffs and the shared narrative, so the assessor hears one consistent story rather than disconnected fragments. Evidence custodians are another role that many organizations underestimate. Evidence custodians are the people who know where evidence is stored, how it is organized, what the official sources are, and how to retrieve it quickly. Evidence can include policies, procedures, review records, tickets, risk acceptance approvals, training completion records, and monitoring artifacts. In many organizations, evidence is distributed across multiple systems, and if no one is responsible for curating it, the assessment becomes a scavenger hunt. A good evidence custodian role ensures that evidence is gathered in a controlled repository, labeled consistently, and protected from accidental alteration. They also help ensure that evidence corresponds to the control statements and documentation, because mismatched evidence is a frequent source of findings. Evidence custodians do not create evidence. They manage its accessibility and integrity. Defining this role early reduces assessment stress because when a request comes in, the organization can respond quickly and confidently. Subject matter experts are also needed, but their role should be carefully defined so they support the process without becoming overwhelmed. Subject matter experts are the people who can explain technical architecture, operational workflows, security monitoring processes, or vulnerability remediation practices in detail. They are essential when the assessor asks how a control is implemented at a high level and what evidence demonstrates it. However, if you do not define their role and schedule, they can be pulled into constant meetings and interruptions, which can degrade normal operations and increase error. A good preparation approach defines which subject matter experts will participate in which parts of the assessment, establishes who can speak on behalf of which components, and ensures they are briefed on the system boundary and control narratives so their answers stay aligned. This is not about coaching people to say scripted lines. It is about ensuring people understand the official scope and the official control story so they do not accidentally contradict it. Subject matter experts are most effective when they are used deliberately rather than as a general pool of people the assessor can call at will. A role that becomes important during assessments is the risk and exception decision role, which may be a governance committee, a risk officer, or an authorized manager depending on the organization. Assessments often surface situations where a control is partially implemented, a compensating control exists, or a vulnerability exception has been accepted. The assessor may ask to see formal approval and may ask whether the exception is time-bounded and reviewed. If you do not have an identified role that can confirm and provide those decisions, the organization may appear disorganized or may be forced to make decisions under assessment pressure. That is risky because decisions made under pressure can be inconsistent or poorly documented. Defining the risk decision role early ensures that exceptions and risk acceptances are handled through the normal governance process, not improvised during the audit. It also provides a clear path for resolving disputed applicability or ownership questions quickly. This keeps the assessment from turning into a negotiation session. Defining roles early also includes defining how the organization communicates during the assessment, because miscommunication is a major driver of confusion and findings. You want a clear rule for who communicates with the assessor, how requests are tracked, and how responses are reviewed before they are delivered. The assessment lead often acts as the single coordination point so messages are consistent. Control owners and subject matter experts provide content, but content is reviewed for consistency with scope and control narratives. Evidence custodians provide artifacts, but artifacts are checked to ensure they match the request and are current. This communication discipline prevents a common failure where an engineer, trying to be helpful, provides extra information that expands the scope or reveals an undocumented practice. It also prevents the opposite failure where the organization provides incomplete responses because no one realized a request had multiple parts. The goal is not to hide information. It is to provide accurate, scoped, well-supported answers. Early role definition makes that behavior normal rather than forced. Another aspect of early preparation is planning for interview readiness, which is really about alignment between documentation and live practice. If your documentation says access reviews occur quarterly, then the person responsible should be able to describe how the review is conducted and show records that match that cadence. If your documentation says monitoring alerts are triaged, then the response team should be able to describe the triage process and show examples of handled alerts. If your documentation says vulnerabilities are remediated within defined timeframes, then the vulnerability owner should be able to show tracking records that reflect those timeframes and exceptions when needed. The fastest way to lose assessor trust is to have documentation that describes one reality and staff interviews that describe another. Defining roles early gives you time to reconcile those differences before the assessment begins. It is not about rehearsing answers. It is about ensuring the program is coherent. By the end of this lesson, the main outcome is that you understand how to prepare for an assessment or audit by defining roles and responsibilities early so the process is orderly and defensible. You identify an assessment lead who manages coordination, a system owner who provides accountable governance, control owners who can explain and evidence specific controls, and evidence custodians who keep artifacts organized and retrievable. You also identify subject matter experts for deep technical questions and a risk decision role for exceptions and boundary questions that require authority. You establish communication discipline so responses are consistent and scoped, and you ensure interviews align with documentation and actual practice so the assessment story does not contradict itself. When roles and responsibilities are defined early, assessments become manageable because the organization is not inventing a process under pressure. It is demonstrating a process that already exists. That is what mature compliance looks like: calm, coordinated verification of steady operations rather than an emergency performance staged for an auditor.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.